Good evening, everybody. My name is Aaron Sito. I'm the Curatorial Manager of Asian and Pacific Art here at the Queensland Art Gallery. And welcome tonight to Perspectives Asia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, custodians of the land we meet upon, and pay my respect to elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge a number of distinguished guests here tonight. Professor Roy Webb, the former Vice-Chancellor of Griffith University, Captain Casper Kuiper, Honorary Consulate of the Netherlands to Queensland, representatives from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and members of the Australia-Indonesia Business Council. Welcome. I'd like to note the apologies of Mr. Chris Sains, the Director of the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, and Professor Ian O'Connor, Vice-Chancellor and President, Griffith University. They're unable to be here tonight. So this is another exciting edition of our Perspectives Asia series of talks and seminars. This is a collaboration between the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University and ACAPA, which is the gallery's Australian Centre of Asia Pacific Art. It's a collaboration which is now in its 11th year. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Yering Station, and of course I'd like to acknowledge the staff at Griffith Asia Institute for their close collaboration. In particular, Natasha Vary and my colleague Ruth McDougall. They do a great job in setting this series of talks up. The various discussions we have had here through Perspectives Asia on Indonesia have always been timely. I think it's a reflection of the close geographic proximity and the complex social, political and cultural relationships that exist between our two countries. 2016 represents 70 years of Australian journalists reporting from Indonesia. And tonight we are joined by George Roberts, who shares anecdotes from his time reporting during one of the most turbulent times of the Australia-Indonesia relationship. After a brief stint working in Indonesia in 2011, George Roberts was appointed ABC's Indonesia correspondent in Jakarta between 2012 to 2015. During this time, he covered some of the most significant tensions in the country's relationship with Australia, including asylum seeker boat tragedies and the Australian government's boat turnbacks. The fallout from revelations of Australian spying, as well as the 2014 presidential election and the execution of 2 Australian drug smugglers. Prior to this post, he covered federal politics for ABC radio and TV in Canberra, was a multimedia reporter in the Sydney newsroom and was Western Sydney reporter for ABC Radio and TV News. He's also been a radio news presenter and producer for both ABC News and Triple J. Tonight's installment of Perspectives Asia is a rare opportunity to hear a first-hand experience of this period and the roles that journalists play in telling them. It is a particular pleasure to have George here tonight, so please join me in making him welcome.
Ibu-ibu dan bapak-bapak, selamat malam dan selamat datang ke GOMA. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to GOMA. Thank you very much for that introduction. I figured I should start with a little bit of Bahasa Indonesia, given we're talking about Indonesia tonight. First, I must say it's a pleasure to be here at speaking at this event, but it's also a little bit odd because I'd normally be the one sitting in the audience asking the questions, probably trying to get some audio, telling a cameraman or camerawoman what I wanted, and then asking the questions. Certainly not an expert in any way, shape or form, so I feel a little bit like a fraud, or at least a fish out of water. But I suppose journalists are in a very lucky and privileged position, or I feel we are, in that we get to be right there as news happens, and we get to experience firsthand events that end up going down in history from a front seat and speak directly to primary sources. And so from that point of view, from an academic point of view, I sort of feel that I'm a very, sort of lucky person getting to have a sort of front row seat, as I said, in things that then become part of the history books. As was mentioned, my time in Indonesia was certainly quite rocky in terms of the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. So I feel lucky, even though that sounds funny, to have been there at a time like that, because journalists, in a sense, are a little bit like emergency room physicians. We sort of thrive on being there when everything's going wrong. At least, that's what some of us do. Now, before I get started, and I hope we can cover some topics like how to catch a people smuggler, and what Indonesia and Indonesians think about Australia, because those two things are quite different. I must point out that the opinions tonight are my own and not representative of the ABC. But first, some background as well on how I ended up being Indonesia correspondent. A few years ago, I'm ashamed to say, I was like too many Australians. I didn't know much about Indonesia at all. Nowadays, Australian customs accept that when you arrive back from Indonesia or you arrive back from Bali and you say, country of origin, if you put down Bali, they accept that because an extraordinarily large proportion of people think that Bali is a separate country to Indonesia. Now, I wasn't that bad, but it is quite embarrassing when you're there and you find out how many people have that view. In fact, a friend of mine arrived in Bali for a wedding a couple of years ago, and in the passport queue in front of him was a man who saw his arrival card and said, "Indonesia? What the are we doing in Indonesia? I thought we were going to Bali." And his wife said, "Bali's in Indonesia." And he said, "Well, you didn't tell me that," as if it might have changed his plans. So I'm glad I wasn't that naive. I knew that the country had been under a dictatorship. It was now a democracy. Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, former general, was the president when I arrived there in 2011 for a brief stint. And the way that came about was pretty much self-interest. I was wanting a posting overseas. I had my heart set on the Middle East, and I was trying my hardest to do whatever I could to get a posting. And then I got an opportunity to go and fill in for Matt Brown, who's now in the Middle East, who was my predecessor in Jakarta. So when the phone rang from the head of international news at the ABC saying, "Do you want to go to Indonesia for 6 weeks to fill in?" I said, "Yes," straight away, not really thinking about what that meant. So I'm a bit embarrassed that my understanding a few years ago of Indonesia was, severely lacking. But when I got there, I thoroughly enjoyed the work, really enjoyed the friendliness of the people and the culture and the challenge of learning the language. And obviously the realisation of just how important it was to be reporting on Indonesia. So I feel very lucky to have had that opportunity. And then about 6 months later, when the job came up permanently, I applied, and I think I pretty much Stephen Bradbury'd it and everyone else fell over, and I somehow managed to get it. So that was very lucky. So that was mid-2012. We were a year and a bit out from a federal election. Asylum seeker boats, barley and beef were the things that, for most Australians, defined the relationship between Australia and Bali. And, Australia and Indonesia. Shall I leave now? I'll get back on that plane. Before I went though, people said to me, how's your Bahasa? And I didn't even know what they meant. I thought, that must be the language. I didn't know that that's actually the word for language, and I could have just replied, my Bahasa Inggris is really good. Thanks. So anyway, during the time I was there, I covered numerous asylum seeker boat tragedies, I'm afraid to say, multiple policy changes as the governments in Australia and in Indonesia changed. There was, of course, the spying scandal, the withdrawal of 2 ambassadors, asylum seeker boat turnbacks, the release of Schapelle Corby, and the execution of 2 Australian drug smugglers. So, not since supporting the independence of East Timor, or perhaps Australia's decision at one point to grant asylum to a boat load of Papuans from Indonesia, had Australia and Indonesian relations had Australia and Indonesia had such a rocky relationship. I think it's interesting to point out, or important to point out though, that not all the tensions over the time that I was there and in this recent chapter were of the doing of the current government. The big ones that people like to point to, or that obviously come up regularly, are things like boat turnbacks, obviously the withdrawal of the two ambassadors, which happened during that time. But tensions, as I observed it, started before that. The ongoing toing and froing of boat policy and what would or wouldn't happen if there was a change of government obviously contributed to that. But the Labor government also did, if I can say, annoy or perhaps put Indonesia a bit offside on a number of occasions. And a lot of that was to do with lack of consultation. So, for example, when Australia announced that it was going to do the Malaysia deal, which would see thousands of people swap between Malaysia and Australia in what they called the Malaysian solution, or the Malaysian people swap deal, Indonesia didn't know about that, and it came as a surprise because Indonesia, as a co-chair of the Bali process, in its view, Australia should have consulted with Indonesia. And any policy on that issue that affects Indonesia, or any policy Australia does, which can, in Indonesia's view, affect Indonesia because they see that as a unilateral action, and a lack of consultation through the Bali process. So the Malaysia deal was one point where Indonesia was not happy about not being told and it coming as a surprise. And there were some others as well. The two cases of spying, although they were revealed later, once the coalition got into power, it's important to remember that those happened under the Labor government. So they were under the previous government. It was just the way that it was approached by the coalition when they got into power and when it was revealed that Indonesia took exception to, or most exception to. The reopening of Manus Island when Kevin Rudd came back to power in Australia before the 2013 election, that also came as a surprise to Indonesia. Just about 24 hours beforehand, Kevin Rudd had flown to Jakarta, had a meeting with Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and had pulled off a coup, effectively, for Australia in getting him to agree to cancelling visas on arrivals for Iranians, which was expected to have an impact on how many people from Iran would go to Indonesia to try to get on a boat to go to Australia. And then 24 hours later or so, it was thereabouts, within days, he signed a deal with Papua New Guinea to reopen Manus Island, and Indonesia seemed stumped by it. Again, they felt that they had not been consulted and this wasn't the process that they thought they'd signed up to under the Bali process. So those kind of things sort of, it seemed, from my observation of covering those events, set the tone in a way for things that were then to come. The relationship was already rocky. Things probably hit, not a rock bottom, but there was certainly a defining moment when Indonesia's approach to Australia and willingness to discuss Australian policy came to a halt. Sorry, not Australia's approach to Australia, but sorry, Indonesia's approach to Australia, but their willingness to talk to us about what was going on. And that was after the former Foreign Minister Bob Carr took Marty Natalegawa on morning television, and Marty Natalegawa was effectively forced to go further than his usual diplomatic language by the TV presenter to effectively say that he wasn't happy with the coalition's policy in the lead up to the 2013 election. After that, Marty Natalegawa, the former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, pretty much stopped taking phone calls from the media and stopped talking to us and stopped giving an opinion about Australian policy. And he'd already said that he really didn't want to get into a running commentary and talk about an election cycle in Australia. But after he was taken on morning television in Australia, there was a clear change in the way that he was willing to engage and talk about the relationship. So that sort of seems like all ancient history now. Of course, then we had a change of government. Tony Abbott flew to Jakarta for the inauguration, for his first visit and his first meeting with SBY. And then things started to get pretty interesting in terms of the major events that were outlined before, which is we heard of revelations of boats being turned back. Boats started to turn up on Indonesian shores. Suddenly these strange orange boats started appearing, and we were trying to get to the bottom of it. And as you might know from one of our investigations for 7:30 report, we got the first ever footage of a boat turn back in process. And that was the first time that Scott Morrison admitted that this is what the orange boats were being used for, because we had the evidence there. Then before that, actually, I should have said, was the spy scandal. Now that, it was not the spying itself that was probably the problem. The thing that President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono particularly objected to and outlined in his speeches when he reacted to that was the fact that Australia refused to respond to Indonesia's request for an explanation, and so that it was the handling of it that the president took particular exception to. So first there was the spy scandal, then there were boat turnbacks, then we had Schapelle Corby's release, and obviously the executions. And the executions obviously was a long and painful debacle for everybody involved, and particularly painful for the families. So that's a bit of an overview. I presume people will have some questions about individual moments in that history or things that I might be able to shed light on. But I thought I'd just talk about a couple of other things that are interesting to note. There are some really great things being done between the Australia and Indonesia relationship. And Griffith University is actually part of one of those things, and not to kind of, slap the government on the back too much, because that's not the job of a journalist, but the Colombo Plan and the Achichas program, which you may or may not be aware of, which is the Australian Consortium of In-Country Indonesian Studies, which is a very long acronym, or a very long name for sending Australian students to Indonesia to study over there, is something that Griffith University got on board with in 2014. And I wish that I had a chance to do that, or had done it when I was the student's age, because you see them arrive in Indonesia and their understanding of Indonesia, and their affection for one of our closest neighbours, and certainly our closest neighbour, and how that transfer of culture and knowledge and understanding helps. And so, Griffith can be congratulated for getting on board with that. But there's many things to do with, as I said before, the way that Indonesia views Australia is different from the way Indonesians view Australia. To give you an example, after the executions of Myron Sukumaran and Andrew Chan, so obviously it took months and months of toing and froing, not knowing when it was going to happen. From my point of view of reading of the politics, it was unfortunately a foregone conclusion that it would happen. But the debacle of the Indonesian process drew that pain out for the families for a very long time. After it all happened, I came back to Jakarta and went to have a coffee in my coffee shop. I walked in and the staff in there said, "Oh, hello, Mr. George, how are you?" "Oh, very well, thank you." They said, "Oh, can we still be friends?" And sorry, I haven't talked about this before. It was the first time that I thought, wow, here was somebody working in a coffee shop who was so engaged with what was happening between two countries and so concerned about the relationship. And I think so. Whatever happens at a government level is completely different from what happens at a person-to-person level. And that's why those programs of people going to Indonesia, finding out that Bali is not Indonesia and it's just part of Indonesia, and seeing things more broadly are really important. So there were, some other things that you might not know. That's probably a defining picture of Indonesia. This is probably what people think about Indonesia. Most of you are probably quite engaged with Indonesia. I imagine that's why you're here. So I'm probably preaching to the converted. But there's a lot more to see. That's a much younger, thinner George Roberts. That's before 3 years of working overseas. It is a beautiful and surprising country, full of a whole diverse group of people, and completely different landscapes. As those of you who like geography would know, the Wallace Line runs straight through Indonesia. There are hundreds of different dialects and cultures across the archipelago, and it really is a beautiful place to travel through. And that's another great thing about being a journalist, is you get paid to travel around, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, you often stay in complete dives. And yeah, I won't go into the details of that. But that's Raja Ampat, which is in West Papua, which is probably one of the most beautiful places on earth. This is one guy who was just collecting his coconut for the morning that I just thought was fantastic. He was about 30 metres up that tree. And then you see him in the top right-hand corner, the coconut falling down, and then him giving me the thumbs up there. So it's a lot of effort to go for a coconut, which probably costs about $1.50. Of course, there's wonderful flora and fauna as well. I was told shortly after hugging that orangutan that, by the way, the orangutans at the zoo have tuberculosis, and did wonder why its cute little coughs. So it was I thought, you can have it back now, thank you. There's a lot of things about Indonesia that people don't know. That's Labuan Bajo. I don't want this to turn into an Indonesian tourism expo, but it is quite an incredible country. Look, I might, I think, probably throw open to any questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. I don't know how this works, this bit. I do have a couple of, how to catch a people smuggler. Should I go into that first? I might just go into that. Yeah, I might. So covering boats, people probably remember, the big flashpoints like the burned hands allegations and the boat turnbacks and things like that. But a lot of covering the asylum seeker issue was things like making contact with people. And for months and months and months, I'd been working a contact who was, I'd been working some people smuggling contacts. And some of them were tipping me off about when boats were leaving and those kind of things. And, you might get a call on a Friday night saying, these guys are leaving Punjab, they're going to get on a boat, their bus is leaving in an hour, those kind of things. But there was one contact that I was working who was a convicted people smuggler, and he was in prison, and I'd been going to visit him. Now, Australian policy about catching people smugglers has ranged from Indonesia not doing enough, which is a fair allegation, although it's, counter to that is it has 17,000 islands to police, and that's quite difficult and limited resources, to things like the boat buyback scheme, which I'm disappointed didn't get off the ground, because I invested heavily in old boats, waiting for the Australian government to come knock. I've still got about 15. No, I'm just kidding. So, and a bunch of other policies that were all aimed at catching people smugglers and stopping boats. So I've been working this contact in an Indonesian prison who was a convicted people smuggler. He's the only people smuggler that I've ever met who was remorseful about what they'd been involved with. One of their friends was on the boat that they had a hand in sending. They were a low-rung operative, but the boat had been overloaded with people. About 100 people drowned, and one of them was his best friend. As well as his best friend, he was also very upset about other people from his ethnicity who were on the boat. So he's the only people smuggler I've ever met who's remorseful, but that doesn't, forgive, his hand in things. But I've been working him for quite months, going and meeting him and stuff like that. And the first time I met him, I made contact with him, and I arranged to go and see him in prison. And I said, he said, can you bring something for me? I said, okay. I was thinking, oh God, what could this be? He said, sandwiches. And I said, okay. So I went to all this effort to make these nice chicken sandwiches and, things like that, rocked up to prison. And then he said, next time, can you bring something else for me? And now, you're trying to keep this guy on side. He had me in contact with, all these different people. He had me, sort of being tipped off about things that were going on, people smugglers who had boats ready to leave, people who had, who were buying up, the reaction to the policy. He was plugged into all of that, and he was quite a good contact from a reporting point of view. But it being Indonesia, he'd managed to smuggle, or someone had smuggled, a Samsung tablet, I shouldn't brand things, but a tablet computer into jail. And being, an Indonesian prison, obviously he was quite bored, so he said, can you bring some movies in for me next time on an SD drive? And I thought, oh God, I wonder what a people smuggler watches. Obviously Prison Break, decided that probably wasn't a good one, given he was in prison. So anyway, I sort of, said, well, what do you want me to bring? And he said, Toy Story 3. So as far as I can tell, if you hang out at the next Pixar movie opening in Indonesia with a bag full of sandwiches, I reckon you can nab yourself a people smuggler. The other thing that I toyed with the idea of I was talking to Sarah Ferguson, who I have a lot of respect for, is an incredible journalist, and he's always happy to help young journalists such as myself. Well, I'm actually halfway to 40 now, from 30. So, don't know if I'm young, but anyway, slippery slope. So, but anyway, she's very, very keen to help out and give advice and things like that. And I was wondering if I could smuggle a recording device into the Indonesian prison to interview this guy. They frisk you, you're not allowed to take in recording device, anything, phones, even cables, those kind of things. And I thought I had this little recording device and I wanted to smuggle it into the prison. So I rang up Sarah Ferguson and I said, Sarah, I'm thinking, I'm wondering if I can smuggle a recording device into an Indonesian prison to interview this people smuggler. And Sarah Ferguson said, okay, how are you going to do it? And I said, I don't know if you know Sarah Ferguson, but that was pretty poor takeoff. I'll try and do better. I said, well, I'm thinking of doing it this way. And she said, do you think you can get away with it? I said, well, yeah, I think so, because I've been frisked a number of times. I think there's a couple of ways I could probably do it. But, she said, okay, so, all right, how do you think you're going to do it? I said, I thought about putting it in my shoe. She said, no, don't go the shoe. No, that's a bad option. She said, do you mind if I ask you a personal question? I said, no, that's fine. And I was standing at my house in the garden at the time on the phone in Jakarta. I'll never forget this moment. Possibly Australia's best investigative reporter, I'm on the phone too. And she says, what sort of underpants do you wear? I couldn't believe it. Don't tell Tony Jones, that's her husband. But so she said, I said, well. She said, are they double layer? Do you think you could cut a small hole in your underpants and maybe put them in your underpants? I thought to myself, I'm talking about my underpants to Sarah Ferguson. So there's certainly some bizarre aspects of covering anything. I don't know if any other journalists have that experience, but that'll certainly go down in history. And by the way, I did get Sarah Ferguson's permission to try to take her off and to tell that story this evening. So, yeah. Anyway, happy to open up to any questions, Kathleen.
Thanks, George. I'd like now to open up to the audience for any questions you might like to have for George. Yes, up there.
Would you like to comment on the fires in Sumatra?
On the fires in Sumatra? I don't know about an opinion. I don't know that I have an opinion. I'm not allowed one as a journalist. But what specifically do you mean? Do you mean their impact on the region, or how they should have handled them, or that kind of thing?
Well, the effect on other surrounding countries.
Yeah, certainly is a big embarrassment for Indonesia. So, as many of you would know, the peat, which is obviously underneath the ground, catches on fire, but it's very hard to put out. A lot of people say, well, we put out fires in Australia all the time, but it's slightly different because it burns underground. But certainly the haze problem with Indonesia, the haze drifting across to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Singapore, has been very embarrassing for Indonesia. They did actually, I think, they passed a thing, or they agreed to a measure where if it continued, people could fly in, so Malaysia could say, right, that's it, and fly their own people in to try and sort it out. I must say I haven't kept up with that. I'm not sure how you really go about solving that issue, other than the fact that, the perpetrators are supposed to be, charged, and I believe Indonesia's passed some laws to stop the people who were responsible for those fires. But just in terms of Sumatra, for one of the stories that I did in Sumatra, and I know that the palm oil industry has been blamed for those fires. It's quite incredible to see. I don't know if you've flown over Sumatra or Malaysia, parts of Malaysia, just how much forest has disappeared and been taken up by palm oil. We went to do a story in the Sumatran jungle on Sumatran tigers. That's where that orangutan photograph, or that was related to that orangutan photograph, because we were looking at the treatment of Sumatran tigers. And we turned up. It took us hours of driving through palm oil. We got up at about 4 o'clock in the morning, drove for hours and hours and hours through the palm oil plantations, got to the edge of what we thought was the jungle and started walking into the jungle. And all through the jungle was more palm oil. So you walk along the path and there's some farmer coming out of the middle of the jungle because he's just gone into the jungle and planted his own palm oil in there. And then he brings it back and it gets, sold to the palm oil companies. So it's very hard to know where all the palm oil comes from. Don't know if that is of interest, but Mr. Bushell. Oh, sorry. I should let you moderate. Oh.
I'll let Michael go first.
Okay. Thanks, Kathleen. George, Michael Johnson. Two questions, if I may. I sit on a not-for-profit advisory board with SBY, and obviously it's a great privilege being able to discuss a very interesting topic with a former Indonesian president. He makes the observation that he laments the fact that, in his view, the Australia-Indonesian relationship at the moment is, or has not reached a certain potential, or is at a certain stage where in its relationship that he thinks it could be. Do you think that the political elite, the business elite, particularly the political elite in Indonesia shares that view? That's the first question. And the second is, in your talk you referred to the sort of the difficult stuff and the rocky stuff. What's your sense of the knowledge or the deep knowledge and the understanding and appreciation of Indonesian politics, all the issues that would make for a good relationship amongst the bureaucracy in Australia? The civil servants who, I would presume, have a grounding, have a knowledge, have a language skill, have the cultural stuff. They should be advising the commissions, should be advising the foreign minister, should be advising the prime minister. The quality of that senior group, I'd be very keen on your thoughts on that.
They're very good questions. If I can probably go to SBY first, I think, there's been a very significant change in the way that Indonesia views the world under President Jokowi or Joko Widodo. SBY had the, 1,000 friends, no enemies policy in terms of his foreign policy. Jokowi abandoned that and made no bones about the fact that he is more nationalistic in terms of his foreign policy approach is whatever's in the best interests of Indonesia. So to give you an example of how that was explained to me, I might just jump through a couple of slides here and that'll be relevant in a sec. Here's Joko Widodo. I must apologise to the President for taking a photograph of him with his eyes closed, but he was just blinking, he wasn't asleep. His style of leadership is completely different. So in terms of, so this is at the palace. When SBY would come to the palace, this was at a dinner, SBY would walk in, it would be announced that he was arriving, he'd march in, you weren't allowed to approach him and he'd go and sit at the head table. Joko Widodo in Ramadan invited all the journalists over to the palace for dinner and then said, if anybody walked through, by the way, all the journalists shaking hands with everybody and having selfies, and then got up and then said, okay, has anybody got any ideas for me? Which opened up a can of worms. Imagine getting, journalists' opinions. So anyway, on what you're like as a leader. So, he's got a very different style in that respect, but he also, as I said, he takes an approach of what's in the best interest for Australia. Now, this is sort of relevant to that, at that dinner, he said, okay, want to take any suggestions? So I stood up and one of the people at the palace said, George, please don't complain. And I stood up and reminded him that he'd promised me an interview 5 times the year before and still hadn't delivered. So I stood up and said, Maaf Pak, nama saya George dari ABC Australia. Tahun lalu, Bapak sudah janji saya mungkin 5 tahun. So you promised me maybe 5 times, and I went on to say that I could have an interview with you. I said, I'm still waiting and it's 2015. I'm free tomorrow, how about you? He got up and said in front of the 300 people, well, okay, you can have an interview tomorrow. Of course, it never happened. I got a phone call at 4:30 in the morning. I was thinking, God, I've got to get to the palace, I got summoned to the palace, but before I got summoned there, I was told, oh, no, he can't do it today. So anyway, turned up to the palace, though, to meet some of his people, and it seemed like the interview was on in terms of we were talking about where to do it, we were walking around the palace, and a person who's very close to the president said to me, well, George, I was pretty surprised this morning when the president said he wanted to do an interview with the ABC from Australia. He said, Australia is not on Indonesia's agenda. You are not a priority for us. You're not even a major trading partner. And interviews with Australian media were out of the question. He said, but you embarrassed him into it. Well done. Still waiting, by the way. So clearly not a priority. That kind of gave me an insight into how Indonesia viewed Australia. If we go back and we have a look at this episode, which happened after, it was after the cash for boat turnbacks allegations that, a boat was turned back to Indonesia, arrived back in Indonesia, and the crew all had thousands of dollars worth of US bills with them. People on the boat claimed that they'd seen money change hands from Australian officials. The Australian politicians initially denied it, but then in Parliament did not deny it. The current Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, said to the newspaper, when Indonesia complained about it, said to the Australian newspaper something along the lines of, well, Indonesia should protect its borders and stop the boats leaving, something like that. I don't mean to verbal her. This was the next bilateral meeting between her and Retno Marsudi, the new Foreign Minister. It takes quite a different approach. And in something I've never seen before, and Australian diplomats said after this, for this bilateral meeting, you normally have all those chairs full with your staff. Retno Marsudi, when the bilateral meeting started, ordered that all the staff leave the room and the doors be closed. And she sat down and spoke one-on-one with Julie Bishop, and then came out and they had a press conference. So certainly there's a different relationship there. SBY, you could probably argue, was quite good in massaging the relationship, recognising when Australia might have misunderstood the way to handle things. So, for example, in the response to the spy scandal, the thing that, as I said, SBY was most annoyed about was the fact that the then Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, instead of speaking to Indonesia and instead of responding to requests, stood up in Parliament and said, we don't have to answer, anything about spying. Now, to the Australian electorate, that's probably, what a lot of people think. Well, people spy, we shouldn't have to answer to Indonesia. For the Australian electorate, that probably played well. But for Indonesia, it certainly didn't. But SBY was the one who then wrote to Tony Abbott, a private note. And when Tony Abbott replied, Martin Adelagawa got on a plane from Jakarta, flew with the letter in hand to Bali to give it to SBY in person, so that letter wasn't leaked. Completely different kind of sort of take on how they probably see us now. So I think the nationalist change in leadership in Indonesia is something that Australia is going to struggle with and probably has already. But certainly that, if you look back over the history of the Australia-Indonesia relationship, there's always flashpoints and difficulties. But as both sides say, the nature of our proximity necessitates that we sort of have to get along.
Just to sort of PS on that, I wonder if FBI's thoughts to me is on the basis of his relationship with John Howard, who he has a very soft spot for. Whenever I talk to him and try to get him to come to Brisbane, he says, well, if John Howard's in Brisbane, I'll come. So he's got a very soft spot for former Prime Minister Howard. And I just wonder, given that high with the tsunami support and the financial support, that high point could never be emulated again.
Yeah, well, I guess, probably Australia should hope it can be, but you've got a better insight than I do to what SBY his opinion. But, he also seemed to have a soft spot for Kevin Rudd as well. Certainly he did have a good relationship with John Howard. But, when Kevin Rudd flew in there after he came back to power, he went to see SBY. We were supposed to have a press conference, but SBY and Kevin Rudd spoke for so long at the palace to each other, having tea or whatever they were doing. I don't know what you get up to in a palace, but presumably have tea. They chatted for so long that there wasn't enough time for the press conference. And Tony Abbott obviously spoke very highly of SBY as well. When he was there for the inauguration and when they had those meetings. But so look, it's hard to know. The one thing I can say though about the understanding of Indonesia, I'm probably talking a bit too long on this topic, so I'll try and wrap it up. But the diplomats certainly do have they're all the people who are posted to the embassy. In my experience, have all been really fantastic. So I guess it's up to individual leaders to get advice from the right people and the people who are in the country. They are all very interested in Indonesia and, learn the language and, mix with the culture. And so from that point of view, I suppose officials do. But, the understanding of Indonesia from Australians is pretty bad, as that anecdote I told earlier. But that also extends to other things. So, for example, just simple things like, when we were covering asylum seeker boats leaving, I was asked multiple times by people, can you pop down and interview the people smugglers down at the jump-off points? My response was, which of the 17,000 islands is the next boat leaving from? So even people who should be informed have a simplistic view about Indonesia. There's another question up there. I'll probably have to wrap that one. Oh, sorry. It was Mr. Bushell first.
Just going back to the question about the fires, I think, as you said before, many of them from the palm oil industry, and most of the managers in the palm oil industry are Malaysians. I'd just like to sort of, in your opinion on the relationship between Indonesia and Malaysia, because people in Australia, probably not in this room, possibly think that Indonesia and Malaysia are good mates in ASEAN and all that, where in fact my reading of it, I won't take your thunder and say what I think of the relationship between Indonesia and Malaysia, but one of the stories that I recall is I think the Indonesians were more pleased than most Americans in Australia when Paul Keating called Mahathir recalcitrant.
It's possibly true. I mean, some people like to liken the relationship between Malaysia and Indonesia to Australia and New Zealand, and I don't think that's a very good analogy because we get along with New Zealand a lot better than Malaysia and Indonesia do. One way I like to be cheeky to my Indonesian friends is say, oh, is that a traditional Malaysian batik you're wearing? One of my friends gets particularly riled about that. But yeah, so they do have this kind of, difficult relationship. Obviously, they've fought over parts of Borneo. They both lay claim to batik. And a number of other cultural things. But certainly, I think you're right. They don't have a great relationship, but they, I guess, in the same way that we're close to Indonesia and we have to get along on some things, they have to.
I was just thinking that arrogance and ignorance are pretty closely related.
Are you talking about me, or are you talking about? Okay, right.
It's easy for Australians to be seen as arrogant by Indonesians because we're a tenth of the size of the population, and we tend to downplay the size of our giant neighbours. So I can understand them just thinking, let's swipe them back because they're just an annoying little pipsqueak country. How much would you say that the media has a role in educating people? Do you feel any sort of weight upon your shoulders inside the media to educate Australians about Indonesia and the other way around? Like, do you think that there's a role more for Indonesians to learn more about Australia?
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the job, and sometimes it's frustrating. Well, it was frustrating that, from one perspective, that my time in Indonesia was taken up a lot by things like boats, and it's controversial to say, but I'm probably probably more thankful than most people that the boats have pretty much stopped, because I hoped. Now, I'm not saying I agree with the means or the methods, but certainly it meant, it looked like it would mean that we could actually get on with reporting on all the other interesting things about Indonesia. But for a long time there, it's your job, but holidays are cancelled, you can never take a day off. At 4:30 in the morning, you've got to, go to yet another boat sinking of people, bodies washing up on the beach. Now, that's pretty selfish to put it that way. But the other thing is that, you get tied up in that political one-issue coverage of a country, and you don't get to actually go and do some of the stories that I loved doing before that became it almost became a one-issue posting for a long time there. And so you're right. I think there is an onus on reporters to try to tell more interesting and diverse stories about a country. And certainly, in the time that I was there, the job that I was doing was very politicised as well. And you get attacked for, putting the position of the country you're in. But your job is to try to get people in Australia to understand the perspective of the country you're reporting from, and to understand how it's playing out over there. So yeah, I think yes. I was thinking maybe that was why my shoulders were sore actually, but no, but yeah, I think there is an onus on reporters to try to, obviously impartially and everything else, but do provide a more interesting picture of a country, or at least try to educate people about the country you're reporting from.
What is the influence of religion on the people in Indonesia and government decision making?
Well, that is a topic you could probably talk about for a whole other hour. In some respects, Indonesia is an example of how, it's probably maybe the most successful, I'll say, majority Muslim democracy in the world. 90% Muslim, and functional democracy. Functional on some levels. Others would argue that because corruption's rife, there is a level that maybe it's not functional, but overall it is. It's a fairly stable country, but certainly there are interactions between certain religious groups that have been criticised and challenge Indonesia's image as an accepting, a tolerant country, and particularly treatment of minority Muslim groups. But also Christians, having churches. We did a story about a church being torn down, those kind of things. I think certainly there is an element, there was in the last election, in the presidential election, about, the black campaign, as they called it, against Jokowi was he really a Muslim? They said he was a Chinese Christian from Singapore, and he made the joke, look at my, Wajah Kampungan, my village face. He's, so certainly, to smear a potential presidential candidate is to question whether they're a Muslim. So certainly it does have an influence.
Lady in the black.
Yeah, just want to add to the gentleman's comment there about the Indonesian and Malaysian relationship. Yeah, I would admit that we always fight, because, for example, just like you mentioned before about the batik, so we feel like the intellectual rights over batik, and by the way, UNESCO has signed it. It's actually from Indonesia.
Yeah, I know that. I just like to stir my friend up. Oops. Sorry.
My other comment was, do you think that the lowest point, the relationship between Indonesia and Australia, was when Indonesia actually recalled the embassy from Canberra, Indonesian embassy for Australia, about that spying thing they record?
Yeah.
One recording thing.
Well, certainly, both countries in the time I was there withdrew their ambassadors. Australia withdrew their ambassador over the executions. Indonesia withdrew their ambassador, as you mentioned, over the spying. So, I wouldn't say that is the lowest point in Australia-Indonesia relations, but I think you're getting into dangerous territory, at least I am as a journalist if I say that. Maybe academics and people who are experts on the topic can say, whether maybe the independence of East Timor was probably a lower point maybe. But certainly, there were significant, and I probably could have spoken for longer on some of those issues about how that came about. Yeah, but by the way, I know batik was Indonesian. I just like to stir my friend up a bit about it.
Greg, did you want to say?
Yes, if I could ask you just how free do you think the local press is in Indonesia? What's your sense of
I think the press is, it's not that it's not free, it's just that there are so many vested interests. I mean, most of the media owners are aligned to political parties, and you saw that, you know, play out in the worst fashion in the presidential election, because you had, you know, the two biggest TV stations owned by people who were backing presidential candidates and unashamedly just promoting those candidates. You know, Surya Palo's Metro TV network just had live cross points all over the country wherever Jokowi was going to be, and TV1, you know, obviously the other way to Prabowo Subianto. So I think the issue about press in Indonesia is more about you know, the vested political interests. But then again, there are some outlets, for example, Berita Satu doesn't align itself you know, strongly with anybody, and you could make the argument that, you know, Australian media owners have declared their interests or allegiances as well. So perhaps it's not too dissimilar. You could perhaps potentially make the argument that there's such a massive media landscape in Indonesia. I mean, for example, Hari Tanu owns something like 43 local television stations, 38 radio stations, a host of newspapers. That's just him. And then there's all the others. So, you know, perhaps there's more diversity of media ownership there. But, you know, the thing is, everybody knows when they're watching one of those channels that it's, you know, the biased channels or the ones that have a vested interest, that they know who's paying for it and who it's backing. Interesting question. I'm not privy to how they've been making the editorial decisions over Indonesia coverage at the moment, since the end of my time there, because I left the posting and stood away because it's at their job now. But I suppose we're in a position where we should probably be thankful that there are those stories, rather than just boats, beef and barley, which was what it was before. And, you know, one diplomat said to me back when I think Julia Gillard was in power, said to me, "Why does Australian media always do stories about asylum seeker boats?" And I said, well, because politicians have made it a big deal. You know, sometimes it's because of that. So in a way, I mean, it might be refreshing to be reporting from Indonesia at the moment, where you can do things about closure of red light districts, which is an interesting debate whether they should or shouldn't be. Yeah, but in terms of the governor, yeah, that's an important issue as well. Yeah, and some people think that governor election could, you know, determine who are the next presidential candidates, and it has in the past. It has with Prabowo Subianto, with Jokowi. So I don't know how the decisions are made at the moment in terms of that, but I suppose the individual EPs weigh it up on what the correspondents pitch, and also the understanding of people back in Australia. It probably comes back to understanding as well. You know, if your people aren't, you know, people in media organisations aren't, you know, as engaged with Indonesia, they might not realise that that's playing out in Indonesia and should be covered. But yeah, sorry, it's a bit hard for me to answer that particular thing, but yeah, a lot of it is determined by the politics in Australia, unfortunately, or at least it was during my time there.
I have one more question.
I was just getting started. Sorry.
We're watching now BBC telling us how the Great Barrier Reef works. A year or two back I was watching BBC on the story of India. Now I'm watching BBC on the history of China. What I get from the ABC is police reporting on the latest rows, conflicts, disturbances, conflicts with Indonesia. when's the ABC going to lift its game, join with the excellent scholarship we've had in Australia on Indonesia, and do some in-depth documentaries for the world interpreting Indonesian history, culture, politics?
Good question, and the BBC's coverage is fantastic. I guess that's probably a question from the managers, I'm afraid. I'd love to do a documentary. Yeah, I'll refer that one up. I mean, I'd love to do a documentary on Indonesia. I think you will see some more longer form reporting coming out of Indonesia in the coming weeks and months. I know that there are at least 2 long form pieces that have been worked on. I don't know what they're about. So I hope now, and the ABC, has put 2 correspondents in Indonesia now, which I think is, beforehand ABC had me, and there was AusNet. When AusNet lost its funding, it was just me. But with the changes and restructuring in the ABC, where they had to make, even though they had to make cuts, they made the decision to put 2 correspondents in Indonesia. And so I hope that means that, and I'm sure it does, that there will be more informed reporting, or more diverse reporting, and hopefully more long form reporting, as you said. I mean, I only got the chance to do 1 foreign correspondent piece, so that's half an hour of television in the whole time I was there, because it takes a lot of time. You've got to do at least 2 weeks of shooting, another 2 weeks of scripting and editing, and that's so it was just impossible to remove from the daily news grind of the political relationship and the ructions between the 2 countries. So hopefully now, with that commitment to put 2 people there, hopefully we'll see more of that. It's all right.
Have some vote of thanks. So stay
Sure.
here.
Thanks.
Look, thank you very much to everyone for coming to tonight's event. And look, I'm sure everyone enjoyed all of George's anecdotes and stories, and certainly I did. And I was reflecting as he was talking and thinking, wow, it's almost 70 years that Australians have been reporting from Indonesia. And George's stories really showed how journalists have that, as he said, a front row seat, a really unique position on such, I suppose, momentous and historical events that can occur in a country. It reminded me actually of speaking to my own friends in Indonesia, my own family in Indonesia, and getting their perspective on some of these events. And it really is interesting to hear what people have to say at a grassroots level, as opposed to what you may perhaps hear in the media or otherwise. George, in his speech, also reminded me of those who actually frame and shape the bilateral relationship. And I certainly feel, having, I suppose, been involved with Indonesia for a long time from a personal and business perspective, that it is those who work at these very grassroots levels, like George mentioned the Achichis program, there's the Australia-Indonesia Institute, there's the collaborative work going on between Australia and Indonesia in the red meat and cattle industry, and indeed the business-to-business relationships. And of course, we can't forget the university partnerships between the 2 countries. All of these are very fundamental in shaping what I think is the real relationship between 2 countries of importance. On that note, I'd like to thank our very special guest speaker, George Roberts, and on behalf of the Queensland Art Gallery and the Gallery of Modern Art and the Griffith Asia Institute, I'd like to thank George for his time today. So could you please give your thanks? Yes, I've got a gift for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And just one last thing. Oh, that's good. Malaysian batik. No, just kidding. I'd just like to say, actually, thanks very much for having me, and also congratulations to the audience, because not one person asked me about Schapelle Corby, nobody asked me about the beef trade, and nobody asked me about asylum seeker boats. So congratulations and thanks very much.